On the morning of February 17, 1979, the People's Republic of China launched an artillery barrage on the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Soon after, 100,000 PLA troops crossed the border, advancing into Vietnam. 5 military columns swept through the border regions, capturing several towns and cities. But why did China, a longtime ally, attack Vietnam? After all, the communist parties of both nations shared Marxist ideologies. Ho Chi Minh had often declared that China and Vietnam were comrades and brothers. China had played a pivotal role in helping Vietnam oust the imperialist French and Americans. When Marxist allies have disagreements, they're supposed to resolve them through ideological debates, not warfare. So what led to this sudden shift? As with many historical conflicts, the invasion was the culmination of numerous grievances and disagreements that spiraled into open conflict. The relationship between China and Vietnam had been deteriorating ever since Vietnam's Communist Party reunified the country after the Vietnam War. For centuries, the relationship between the two nations had been fraught with tension, including nearly 1,000 years of Chinese colonization and a 20-year invasion by the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century. Unsurprisingly, the Vietnamese were deeply suspicious of Chinese intentions. In their view, China always saw Vietnam as a junior partner, never an equal, something that became evident whenever Vietnam pursued its own independent path. China had indeed supplied Vietnam with substantial aid during the war against the United States, contributing resources worth nearly $20 billion at a time when China itself could have used that money. However, this aid came with strings attached. Vietnam was expected not to accept any assistance from the Soviet Union. On the Chinese side, there was growing resentment over what they perceived as Hanoi's lack of gratitude for their support. Tensions were exacerbated by escalating border clashes and the persecution of ethnic Chinese in Vietnam. Deng Xiaoping's China believed that Vietnam had become too arrogant and was in need of a lesson for its insolence. This only seemed to confirm Vietnam's suspicion that China would always treat them as an inferior partner, though China appeared oblivious to this perception. Another key factor in the deteriorating relationship was China's desire to warm relations with the West and distance itself from the Soviet Union. To understand China's motives, it's important to note that at this time, the Chinese Communist Party viewed the Soviet Union as its greatest foreign policy threat. The Sino-Soviet split had been ongoing for years, beginning with ideological disputes between Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev, particularly after Khrushchev denounced Stalin in his infamous secret speech. While the Soviets occasionally sought to mend relations, China remained distrustful, especially as the USSR maintained large military forces along the Sino-Soviet border and conducted live-fire exercises there. In July 1967, Deng Xiaoping emerged as China's paramount leader, holding multiple titles, including Vice Chairman of the Communist Party and Chief of the People's Liberation Army General Staff. He had wrested power from Mao's chosen successor, Hua Guofeng, after a significant political shift in late 1976. Deng's faction, more moderate in its approach, focused on modernizing China's economy and opening up to the outside world, particularly the United States. They viewed the U.S. as the global leader in technology and innovation. In this context, attacking Vietnam could signal China's seriousness about distancing itself from Soviet influence, while demonstrating its military capabilities to the international community. Deng Xiaoping harbored a deep, perhaps irrational grudge against Vietnam. As China's unchallenged leader, there was no one in a position to oppose him, which allowed the invasion to proceed. Deng directed the PLA to keep the war limited in scope, seeking only to achieve China's political objectives. He was determined to avoid the kind of drawn-out quagmire the U.S. had experienced in Vietnam, while also preventing Soviet intervention. The conflict was planned in 2 stages. The first stage was a 2-pronged offensive, with one prong targeting Xiaobang and Lao Cai, while the second struck Dongdang. This phase lasted from February 17 to 25. In the second stage, PLA forces converged on Lang Son from February 26 to March 5. Once these objectives were achieved, the Chinese army would withdraw and declare victory. Around 330,000 PLA troops were allocated for this largely land-based invasion. At the time, Vietnam's high command was caught off guard by the attack, doubting that China would actually go through with it. But Chinese propaganda had been preparing for this, painting Vietnam as the Soviet Union's lapdog and the Cuba of the East. Furthermore, China evacuated some 300,000 civilians from its border regions with the Soviet Union to guard against any potential Soviet counterattack. Meanwhile, many of Vietnam's troops were away from the border, engaged in military operations in Cambodia. This left only about 150,000 regional security forces and militia to face the PLA. Chinese military planners underestimated these local forces, assuming they had an overwhelming numerical advantage of 8-1. In reality, the fight was closer to 2-1, and these local militias were highly trained and well supported by the local populace, which greatly intensified the resistance. On February 17, 1979, at 5 a.m., a massive artillery barrage erupted along the Sino-Vietnamese border, followed by the advance of 100,000 PLA soldiers, accompanied by tanks. Their main objectives were the cities of Lang Son, Cao Bang, and Lao Cai, with Lao Cai being of particular strategic importance due to its railway connection to Hanoi. Notably, Deng had restricted air support, limiting Chinese aircraft to Chinese airspace. This forced the PLA to rely solely on ground forces, which suffered heavy casualties as they engaged in brutal combat, often charging fortified positions. Despite significant losses, the PLA advanced, capturing border towns and pushing toward Lao Cai. In Dong Dong, they encountered their first major resistance from Vietnam's elite Flying Tiger Regiment. Vietnamese commanders speculated on China's goals, unsure if the invasion was aimed at annexing borderlands, causing economic damage, or advancing deeper into Vietnam. On February 20th, Beijing finally made the invasion public, boasting of heavy losses inflicted on Vietnam. They claimed to have killed or wounded 10,000 Vietnamese, while suffering only 3,000 casualties themselves. However, Chinese forces faced fierce resistance, with Vietnam employing jungle warfare tactics, booby traps, and fortified positions that took a toll on the PLA. The rainy season further hampered Chinese logistics, forcing them to use horses and donkeys for transport. Nevertheless, the PLA captured Lao Cai and Cao Bang by February 21, 22. Both sides reinforced their positions as they converged on Lang Son, where the heaviest fighting would take place. Lang Son, just 85 miles from Hanoi, was strategically significant. The PLA followed Mao's strategy of encircling the city before attempting to capture it. By March 2nd, the city was mostly surrounded, though at a heavy cost in casualties. On March 3rd, the PLA launched its final assault on Lang Son, successfully capturing key positions and encircling the city. With their objectives achieved, the Chinese leadership stuck to their word. On March 5th, they declared victory and began to withdraw, signaling the end of the conflict. Vietnam, for its part, did not escalate the situation and allowed the orderly withdrawal of Chinese forces. The PLA's performance in this war was underwhelming, and Chinese military planners admitted as much in their reports. Initially, they believed they could capture Hanoi in a week using a fraction of their forces. In reality, they struggled to make headway even in the border regions. Despite deploying 10 full divisions, the equipment was outdated, tactics were rigid, and morale was low, with reports of units being forced to advance. While the war didn't provide a clear picture of how the PLA might perform in future conflicts, it did reveal how the Chinese Communist Party views war as a tool to achieve political objectives. In their view, the PLA had succeeded by delivering a clear message to Vietnam, even though the military itself struggled operationally. In many ways, this approach mirrors that of the Soviet Red Army. For the Chinese Communist Party, if political goals are achieved, then the military has succeeded, no matter how many lives were lost in the process. We hope you enjoyed this historical documentary. Like and subscribe if you want to see more.